Fact versus theory. What is the difference? People use these words like they mean the same thing, but do they? Well, it turns out they're actually completely different. So in this video, we're going to talk about the difference between a theory and a fact. We're also going to talk about a hypothesis and a law. So we have theories, facts, laws, and hypothesis. How are all these things related? What's the difference between them? Stick around and we'll find out. So first, let's start with a fact. It's a very simple, easily observable phenomenon. That's all it is. So for example, when I drop this ball, it falls downward. That's a fact. Another fact is when I look outside, the sun appears to rise in the east and set in the west. That's a fact. Easily verifiable. You can watch it yourself. Another fact could just be an agreed upon measurement. For example, 12 inches is defined as 1 foot. That is a fact. So facts are just statements about reality. They don't attempt to talk about why or the underlying cause. They simply are statements. And that leads us to a hypothesis. So a hypothesis is an educated guess or prediction about something. So for example, this ball falling. I could say that my hypothesis is the ball falls downward because there's a force of gravity between the planet Earth and this ball, and that force is pulling them together. But the hallmark trait of a hypothesis is it must be testable. If it's not testable, then it's not a true hypothesis. For example, if I say, my hypothesis is this ball falls downward because invisible fairies are pushing it down when I let it go, but you can't see the fairies, they exist in a different dimension, just trust me. That's not a hypothesis. You can't run a test to determine if it's true or not, or false, so therefore it's not valid. And that leads us to a theory. So what is a theory in science? Well, it's not the word that you think it might be. It's not just a guess. Sometimes your friend might see something and say, hey, I have a theory about that, and they'll give you some kind of guess. But that is not what scientists mean when they say theory. A theory is an overarching explanation or model for how something works or a process that has occurred over time. And that theory comes from mountains and mountains of data collected through thousands of experiments over the years. So scientists keep doing experiments, keep testing hypotheses, and eventually they get a theory which wraps it all up and gives us an explanation for the root cause or the overarching picture. Now, some theories out there, like the theory of evolution and the theory of gravity, they get a lot of flack because people say, well, that's just a theory. It's not a real fact, therefore it's not true. But they're using the word theory incorrectly. Remember, it's not a guess, it's an explanation that comes from lots and lots of evidence. And if you want to disprove a theory, it's very easy. All you have to do is just one experiment. And if that one experiment can show that something in that theory is not true, then the whole theory gets thrown away. So now we know the difference between a fact, a theory, and a hypothesis. And that leaves just a law. So what is a law? Well, a law is usually a statement about a relationship between objects, and it's often described as a mathematical equation. So let me give you an example. This is Newton's law of universal gravity. So I'm going to write it on the board. So this law explains a relationship between a bunch of different things. And so I'll just tell you that Fg stands for force of gravity. This big G is just a constant, so it could be some number, let's just say 6 for this example. It's not really 6. And then these are variables. This is the mass of one object, the mass of the other object, and d is the distance between them. So it's basically, this is a law that tells us that if you know the mass of two things, like me and the earth or the earth and the sun, and you know the distance between those things, you can actually calculate the force of gravity between them. So what have we learned today? Is gravity a fact, a theory, or a law? Well, the only correct answer to that question is yes, all of the above. It's a fact that things fall, that's gravity. It's a law that, the force of gravity is related to the masses of two objects divided by the distance between them squared. And gravity is explained by a theory called the general theory of relativity, which was developed by Albert Einstein. So all of those things are true about gravity, but in order of simple to complex, it really goes fact, then law, and theory is at the top of the chain, right? So the next time someone says, that's just a theory, you tell them, yeah, it is. And that's why I know it's true, because it's backed by mountains of evidence.